All right, everybody. Now I want to kind of return to a basic question that we started this entire unit with. So we're thinking about prosocial behavior, things that people are doing for others, and we come to this basic question, right? That we know is maybe not the ideal question, but are human beings good? And we know obviously that people can be good. We've talked about different ways that they can, helping in emergency situations, helping when it comes to committed long-term volunteering relationships. But let's talk about the motivations of why people might volunteer and under what circumstances, and not just volunteer, but to help in general. So again, remember, prosocial behavior, any actions that are benefiting other people, but it's important to remember that any prosocial behavior is generally going to involve things that get the helper a reward. Prosocial does not necessarily mean altruistic, so just by thinking about the motivations that might reflect back on a person, that doesn't mean that they're not being prosocial. It just means that they're not completely selfless, right? So some different motives that are going to be the big predictors of people helping others are reciprocity. If we're doing something for, say, a favor that's going to be paid back later, or some other kind of support. Social affiliation, we like to have and make friends, and helping each other out is a good way to do that. In general, just trying to feel good about ourselves and avoid feeling bad. And empathy, that we kind of put ourselves in each other's shoes and are able to take the perspective of other people. So let's think about these things in turn a little bit. Reciprocity is maybe best thought about in terms of a theory that goes way beyond prosocial behavior, and it's relevant in relationships and intergroup relations too. Something called social exchange theory by Thibault and Kelly. This one is relatively straightforward, thinking that it's just kind of a cost-benefit analysis about when we're likely to help people. If we're going to get more out of it than we're going to have to give, sure, we'll help. But if it's going to cost us a lot and we're not really going to get that much out of it, then we're much less likely to do it. So if helping is going to be easier, on average, we're going to be more likely to do it. And if, we're getting something from other people, then that's very good for our chances of helping people. So frequently, if we have gotten help from somebody before, or we have expectations that they're going to help us, we're going to be more likely to help them, basically. Moving to the social affiliation motivation, that we just generally as human beings have this need to affiliate with others and to belong with other people. We literally have mountains of research about something that researchers just call a need to belong, that we probably have, or almost certainly have evolved to feel this kinship with other people, and it's kind of helped us be able to band together. And we know from our own lives that it's something that people do frequently to try to make friends and ingratiate themselves to people is do favors, and that might take the form of like literal acts that people are doing or things they're giving each other, or it might just be as simple as things like compliments and kind words or vouching for somebody. But doing something for somebody else often is getting you some sort of social capital in some ways. And we know that people that are, looking for friends are more likely to try to make friends on average are going to be people that are going to be more likely to engage in helping behaviors as well. If we think about a couple pieces of research evidence, if you look at people that report being lonely, and you put them into these different types of games that people often use for social exchanges and research. A dictator game where people are deciding how much money they're going to give another person, and that other person doesn't really have any say in it. So let's say you have $10 and you can decide if you're going to give another participant $1 or $0 or $5 and make it even. People are more likely to give the more lopsided, unfair allocations in those games under certain circumstances, but the people on the other side of it have the option of vetoing those, basically. And people that are lonely and want to affiliate with others are more likely to accept more unfair arrangements in those situations. And we also know from other evidence that if people have just experienced rejection, there are lots of different games that researchers can use, like one called Cyberball, where it's literally just simulating playing catch, and they can program it so the other two, ostensibly people, but they're really just part of the program, start playing with each other and don't play with you. And other research where people are engaging in like text message conversations and then get excluded by the other people. People that have just experienced that kind of rejection are more likely to give other people more money. There's suggestions about the mechanism, basically, that they are trying to ingratiate themselves to them to be more socially desirable to those people. I also mentioned that people, sometimes help just to feel good and try to avoid feeling bad in general. Seems pretty straightforward too, but we, can often just kind of bolster our own internal feelings by helping people and avoid those negative emotions. This generally is an idea that's formalized into a model by a researcher named Bob Cialdini called the negative state relief model. Basically, if you help other people, it makes you feel good, and that's why we do it. But just like we talked about self-affirmation in the cognitive dissonance unit, that, if you can affirm things about yourself, that kind of buffers you from dissonance and makes you feel better, and then you might not change your mind. The negative state relief model makes a similar prediction, saying if you can make yourself feel good in some other way that's less effortful, well, then you're not going to help people. So helping people helps make you feel better, but if you already feel better, then there's no motivation to help other people, basically. So these are all, pretty selfish reasons in a lot of senses about how we might go about helping other people. That we get something out of it. In terms of favors, we make friends and feel more socially connected, or we feel better and avoid feeling negative. But there is another type of explanation for prosocial behavior that's maybe a little more encouraging about human nature in a sense, because these are all, kind of pessimistic and make us all look kind of crappy and selfish in some ways. Thinking about empathy is a really important way to kind of see how people might be a little more true-hearted in some sense. So just to first kind of break down what empathy is and what I mean by that. I mean, you probably have a sense of what it means in general, but researchers think of it as having lots of different components. So empathy has an emotional component that you actually are sharing and experiencing to some degree the feelings of another person, their positive or negative feelings. Cognitively, you understand the feelings, you can kind of describe them and realize their content, and maybe more importantly, you realize that they're not yours. You know that you are just kind of simulating that experience another person is having. They're not your own feelings. And motivationally, empathy leads us to want to make other people feel better. So we feel their feelings, we know they're not ours, we understand them, but we want to help other people feel better, alleviate their suffering, or sometimes even keep the positive feelings they already have. So Dan Batson, another researcher that has a relatively influential theory that has to do with empathy, called his idea the empathy altruism hypothesis. Basically, that these types of concerns that we have coming out of empathy from those emotional, cognitive, motivational reactions, this is probably, according to Batson, the big predictor of when we help other people. So basically that, if we are able to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, there are circumstances where we know someone needs help, and if we're able to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, we're going to feel empathy. We're going to have Batson calls it an altruistic or selfless motive to make that person feel better. That's how we're going to satisfy that altruistic motive, by making them feel better. If we don't put ourselves in another person's shoes, we will feel bad, maybe because we are, just selfishly wishing that we were not around distress or experiencing distress, and then we might have an egoistic reason to reduce our own distress. So kind of a different set of predictions there. And it's also important to think about how sometimes the benefits that are involved in prosocial behavior they don't reflect on oneself. So if they're altruistic and they're really about this empathic concern, then in some cases, you might have people that are really selflessly trying to help other people, according to Batson. And obviously, the negative state relief model, trying to feel good and not feel bad, is kind of at odds with this empathy altruism idea. So Batson and the empathy altruism people are kind of arguing throughout the decades with Cialdini and his people about who's more correct about when we're going to help other people. And Cialdini kind of has a point by basically saying, well, even if we are trying to help people out of empathy, it's just that we're trying to, he says, get rid of our guilt or the pain that we're feeling along with them. Empathy, if we feel their pain, that's still a negative state that we're trying to relieve, right? We don't want to feel their pain, or we don't want to feel bad because we didn't do all that we could. But Batson kind of comes back with some evidence saying, well, even when we don't necessarily need to reduce the negative affect through helping, sometimes we're still going to help, even if that isn't necessarily the case. So some of the things that he suggests, that when people are in positive moods, they're more likely to help. And if the negative state relief model were correct, then we would see people usually trying to help people when they're in bad moods. But we know that's not true from all kinds of evidence, that even little things like lifting your mood are going to make you more likely to help. So people that are happier and in better moods tend to help more, which kind of goes against that negative state relief general idea. And as I'll talk about with this next study, I'll get into, empathy still predicts if people are going to help, even if they have other ways of escaping the situation. So this really interesting study, it had to do with people listening to like a hypothetical situation. They were told it was a student in their class, but it was all fabricated. But a student that they supposedly knew and were taking a class with that had an injury that was keeping the student from attending class. So they were asked if they would share their lecture notes and then meet with this person, hypothetically, and they manipulated some different things about the situation. So they manipulated how difficult it would be for them to avoid Carol, basically, difficulty of escape, and how much empathy they felt for her. In the easy escape condition, they said, you'll never see Carol again, basically. She's going to finish the class at home. She'll never, confront you about this, so she'll never know or be able to say anything to you about whether you helped her or not. In the difficult escape condition, they said, Carol's going to come back to our class soon. So she would be there and presumably, be giving the evil eye to people that hadn't helped her, or so the researchers implied. For the high empathy and low empathy instructions, they used a pretty standard kind of perspective-taking sort of manipulation. They just asked people to think about Carol's perspective and think about her feelings. And the low empathy condition, people were not instructed to think about that. And then they just wanted to see, okay, out of all these people, who's going to help Carol? And what they found was that in the hard escape condition, when people were always going to be confronted with Carol, they found that there wasn't really any difference. Most students tended to help Carol, but there was a big difference in the easy escape condition. That if they were, never going to see her again, people with high empathy still helped her, and people with low empathy did not help her. So the negative state relief model, doesn't quite predict this pattern correctly, because if escape is ever easy, there shouldn't ever really be helping. This high empathy bar would be low according to the negative state relief model, because if they could just not have to talk to her again, then there really shouldn't be a reason that they're going to help. But the people that took her perspective did say that they would share their notes with her. But it's also the case that empathy doesn't necessarily need to be there, because if empathy were explaining the whole story, then we wouldn't see such a high bar here for low empathy. People that are, feeling like they're going to be confronted are also likely to help in these conditions. So neither one of the theories necessarily explains everything about this. It's probably, like everything else seems to be, right when we have competing ideas, it's kind of a mixture of both ideas that might be more correct.